Greetings. Hope things are going well. This is our snippets for this week. So basically, we're going to look at the Bush one presidency, 89 to 93, and then Clinton in the snippet. So this is this famous photograph of then Vice President Bush with President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. And the symbolism here is nice in that Bush represents, at least with regards to the Soviet Union, something of a degree of continuity with Reagan. By late in the Reagan administration, the relationship with Gorbachev is a much more cooperative one. During the Bush administration, it becomes extremely cooperative. The United States wants to move to end the Cold War, but simultaneously wants to do what it can to preserve Gorbachev's position, although ultimately that proves to be impossible. H.W. Bush had a forceful cabinet on national security issues, and arguably, I think, the most talented foreign policy related cabinet that we've looked at in this course is certainly since World War II. He had a background in foreign affairs. He had been director of Central Intelligence and U.S. ambassador, or de facto U.S. ambassador, towards to the People's Republic of China in the 1970s. He had been in Congress. He had been at the UN, been chair of the Republican National Committee, then served 2 terms as Reagan's vice president. His Secretary of State is James Baker, accomplished figure who had been Reagan's chief of staff and then Secretary of the Treasury. His national security advisor, with whom he was very close, was Brent Scowcroft. He does have a little bump in the road. His initial nominee to be defense secretary is this man, John Tower, a former Texas senator, who was not terribly popular with his colleagues. He had retired from the Senate in 1984. He had been the top Republican on the Armed Services Committee, so with jurisdiction over the Defense Department. So in this respect, he seemed to be qualified, but his nomination is also ultimately felled by reports of excessive alcohol use and sexual harassment when he would be doing inspection tours of military bases abroad, and when it's clear that the Senate is not going to confirm him, Bush withdraws the nomination and replaces him with Gerald Ford's former chief of staff, then a Wyoming congressman named Dick Cheney. This is a decision which has very significant long-term results in terms of U.S. politics and U.S. foreign relations. Cheney, as defense secretary, is extremely competent, somewhat, I think, technocratic, quite different in many ways than his performance as vice president. As chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Bush nominates Colin Powell, who becomes the first Black man to serve in this position. Powell, some of you may have seen, just very, very recently passed away from complications of the virus. Was a City College graduate, so one of the most famous recent CUNY graduates. Will later be Secretary of State under Bush II. Flirts with the idea of running for president in 1996, a figure of very significant accomplishments. And then as director of Central Intelligence, Bush will nominate Robert Gates, who also pops up late in the Bush II administration, and then under Obama as defense secretary, likewise very, very well regarded in the field. So basically, this is Bush II is a president who wants to focus on foreign affairs. It's really his chief interest, and he has around him people who reflect his largely non-ideological realpolitik vision of international affairs. Wants to remove some of the hardline edges of the Reagan approach. Now, if you recall, in the last snippets, we talked about the gradual collapse of the Soviet bloc. Bush has to deal with some of the really complicated issues. German reunification after the collapse of East Germany. The East German leadership eventually concludes that it needs to have some kind of democratic election, and pro-unification forces triumph in this. This requires sophisticated dealings with the Soviets in terms of how to handle things. The collapse of the hardline government in Czechoslovakia in a revolution called the Velvet Revolution, which is peaceful. This is a photograph of it. Czechoslovakia, remember, is a country with a democratic heritage in Central Europe that had been the subject of a communist coup in 1948, and then the communist invasion in 1968 when they were trying to have a reformist government. And in the aftermath of this, a coalition government is put in place, bringing back Alexander Dubček, who had been the communist leader who had attempted to liberalize in 1968 and then basically had been banished from public life. He's named as Speaker of the new country's parliament, and the new president is a dissident playwright named Václav Havel. Dubček, unfortunately, is in a car accident and passes away, and a year after the communist rule collapses. But unlike in Poland and earlier in Hungary, where the communist governments went largely peacefully, here it was more of a popular revolt, although there was minimal violence. The only place in the former Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe, anyway, in which there is significant amounts of violence comes in Romania. This is a photograph of then Vice President Ford, then President Nixon, and the man on the right here is Nicolae Ceausescu, who we read about last week in the Kramer article. Ceausescu is a hardline communist leader. Romania it's a repressive government, but he's a clever figure in that, with the Moscow's permission, he occasionally charts an independent course in foreign affairs. So, for instance, remember the U.S. boycott of the 1980 Summer Olympics, the Soviets boycott the 1984 Summer Olympics, which are in L.A., and all of the Eastern Bloc countries followed the Soviets except for Romania. They attend and they get this big cheer, and you're cheering this awful person. So his domestic record is just terrible. But what Ceausescu understands is that if he can feint at being independent of the Soviet Union, that will help him get credits, loans from the West, which keeps his government afloat in the 1970s, keeps his personal bank account afloat. This is a kleptocratic regime with him and his wife, his family controlling significant portions of the Romanian economy. But in the 80s, these loans come due. The government really struggles. Ceausescu resists all efforts at domestic reform. In 1989, late 1989, he's addressing a protest in the capital. This was a Stalinist country, and there were no peaceful protests. And the crowd suddenly starts booing and jeering him, and he looks baffled, which of course he is. He and his advisors realize that the jig is up. They attempt to flee the country, but their helicopter is brought down right near the Hungarian border in this city called Timisoara. And then in a difficult process, Ceausescu and his wife are publicly tried in an immediate trial, hours after they were captured. And shortly thereafter are executed. So there is a violence to the Romanian change of government that was not present in elsewhere in Eastern Europe. And critical in Romania, what sort of distinguishes it from all of the other Eastern Bloc countries, is that a lot of the ex-communists sort of flip sides. They suggest that it was all Ceausescu's problem, and so the transition to a more democratic environment in Romania will be rockier, and it will take several years. In any case, Bush in the U.S., as this is occurring, tries to give the Soviet Union maximum space, and Gorbachev consistently maintains to his policy that we read about in the Kramer article, which is that it's just too expensive for the Soviet Union to maintain this empire in Eastern Europe. The Red Army is going to withdraw, and so even though we get the uprising in Czechoslovakia and then this public execution of the communist leader in Romania, Gorbachev does not send Red Army troops. A decision that the West welcomes. The Bush administration continues to send significant amounts of economic assistance to the Soviet Union, but also a decision that arouses intense opposition from hardliners within the KGB and within elements of the Red Army. All of this kind of comes to a fruition with these three countries: Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The Baltic countries. So these are countries that were independent between World War I and World War II. They are then subject of negotiation between the Nazis and the Soviets. Remember the treaty that was signed just before the start of World War II, this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which assigns to the Soviet sphere of influence the Baltic states. World War II ends with these countries not merely having been conquered by the Soviet Union, but formally annexed into the Soviet Union. The Soviets basically want access to the Baltic Sea, and so for the entire for the entire post-war period, the entire Cold War period, these countries are part of the Soviet Union. In the late 80s, though, nationalist sentiment revives in all three countries, especially in Lithuania. And the question here for Gorbachev is not an easy one. If he grants independence to these countries, which are again seen as part of the Soviet Union, what then would be the rationale for not granting independence to Poland, to Ukraine, or to Armenia, or to Azerbaijan, or to Kazakhstan, all of these other constituent republics of the USSR, whose nationalities were demanding independence. And Gorbachev is strongly pressed on this from even some supporters of glasnost and perestroika. The problem is that there's just terrible timing here for Gorbachev. This is coinciding with the 50th anniversary of the Nazi-Soviet pact, and to bring public international attention to their plight, the peoples of the Baltic states on the 50th anniversary of the pact organized this extraordinary act of civil disobedience, a human chain that runs all the way from Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, down to Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. And this is a protest because it is so imaginative and demonstrates such widespread popular support that gets lots and lots of international coverage. Brings renewed attention to the plight of the Baltic states, and also intensifies nationalist support within the Baltic states themselves. Ultimately, it will be Lithuania that becomes the first of the Baltic states to declare independence. Gorbachev here does send some troops in to try to repress this, but there's strong pressure from the Bush administration, basically telling the Soviets, look, if you do this, you do it. But it's going to cause a significant decline in US-Soviet relations, and it's probably going to make American investors much less likely to invest in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's entire economic program by this point was dependent on foreign capital. And so ultimately, Gorbachev makes the decision to neither really recognize Baltic independence, but also not to resist. And in retrospect, this is the final straw. In the summer of 1991, there was a coup that's organized in the Soviet Union. by hardliners in the defense ministry and the KGB. That Gorbachev is vacationing in the Crimea at this point. He's placed under house arrest. And that coup famously fails when the president of the Russian Federation, so a constituent republic of the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin, a former communist who had broken with Gorbachev in the late 80s, arguing that Gorbachev was being too accommodationist, publicly urges the soldiers not to participate in the coup, gets up on a tank and delivers this address, and the soldiers refuse the orders. The coup plotters are arrested, and Gorbachev is freed, but by this point he has no power. The power has devolved into the constituent republics. And in December of '91, the Soviet Union ceases to exist. The constituent republics replace it. And the Bush administration here, although it had very close relationships with Gorbachev, makes the transition and works very closely with Yeltsin during its final year in office, 1992, and also pushes strongly to try to ensure that the nuclear weapons from the ex-Soviet Union remain only in Russia's hands. And so there are deals worked out in a program called the Nunn-Lugar initiative, named for Sam Nunn, a Democratic senator from Georgia, and Richard Lugar, a Republican senator from Indiana, who both worked very hard on this issue, for the United States to exchange diplomatic and economic assistance to Belarus, to Ukraine, and to Kazakhstan, who were the three former constituent states of the Soviet Union, now independent countries, that had Soviet military bases with nuclear weapons on their soil. And in exchange for these agreements from the U.S., all of these countries agree to give up their nuclear weapons, which is a formidable diplomatic success for the U.S. So this process, in which the Bush administration helps to manage the collapse of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union itself, without bloodshed, and with the coming to power in Russia of what amounted to a pro-American government under Boris Yeltsin, is a considerable accomplishment. Of course, Gorbachev is important in this. Yeltsin himself is important in this. But it's very easy to imagine a U.S. policy that would have fared much poorer under the circumstances. So that's our first snippet for this.